Good afternoon, everybody. It's nice to be with you here. Berlin is a spectacular city to visit for sure. There we go. The name of my presentation today is A Brief History About the Future. I have a very short few comments to make this morning. And as Alex was indicating, I think that all of us can look out to the future and perhaps surmise what we think is going to happen. And certainly all of us have different scenarios about the future. My job today is to lay out just one of those scenarios in terms of what the possibilities might be for you as an individual, that is for you as a professional, as well as for the organizations that you may work for. And as you think about the world, as Alex indicated, my career, like many of yours, has been very commercially oriented for the last sort of 30 years as the founder of a few different research companies, and now in a program that allows me to be a little more reflective about what's happening more broadly in not just the retail space, but obviously the technologic change and the societal changes that are underway in the world today. What I'd like to do is just remind all of you that change is a constant. I think all of us have been through two or three significant changes in our companies, maybe in our careers. My favorite case that they teach at the business school is the Netflix case. And that case is all about what it means to lead through change. In this instance, it was about how the leadership team, which spent 10 years sort of scaling the DVD rental business and had finally achieved fairly high overall household penetration, woke up one day just to realize that they were being outright substituted by a new technology, which was in fact streaming. And just imagine that day where you realize that you're being substituted. In other words, we're running this great business and we have all our capital properly allocated around this particular business. And the next week or the next month or the next year, we find that our capital really needs to be directed in a completely different way. Now, if I said to each one of you here in the room today that the stock price of some company was going to go up 400% today, and I said, take a break, each one of you might find something to do in that 5-minute break because you have great personal flexibility with your capital. But in corporations, and especially in retail, our capital is really inflexible. It's really hard to move the assets around. It's really hard to have great agility with the capital intensity of our particular business. There's some really important lessons that come out of this particular case. But one of them is that change always comes from below. Someone that you don't recognize that has very low adoption, households aren't using, is always the person that comes along and substitutes. The second big lesson in this case is that the substitute, that is, in this case, streaming, always takes volume away from the predecessor. In other words, they drag along the volume to the next generation. And clearly, from a management and a leadership point of view, when you really think about this, if you were Reed running this company, Netflix, what you quickly realize is that you don't have a choice to exit the DVD business and just jump into the streaming business. You have to do both. It's an and world, not a or world. And that's the business risk that's really inherent in managing change. Now, if the quantity and the quality of change, that is the time gap between changes in your industry, are very long, then you don't have these sort of fast cycles that you need to move through. Let's take a look at retail for a minute. In my career, I've seen at least 3 generations of retail. The first of those is the traditional trade. I think many people here in the room may still live in countries where the traditional trade is still the dominant force. In the world today, the so-called fragmented trade, independent retailers, is still 50% of all consumption. It is a very important part of the marketplace that is in a broad global way. But some of you may live in the 30 or 40 countries where we now have a very high share of the market that's now what we'll call simply Generation 2 retail. These are sort of the Walmart generation, the Costco generation, the Carrefours, the Leclercs, those that produced and generated large-scale boxes, in this instance, where they effectively aggregated the volume of the independent retailers in many instances and created entirely new economies. Those new economies lower costs, turned into lower prices, which in turn turned into higher volumes, which drove costs down. Again, I think we're all pretty familiar with that generation as we look back over the last 25 most recent years. But in fact, today, we don't sit in Generation 2. We really sit in at least 8 of the major economies, and I'd argue as many of the 20 of the major economies. The Generation 2 retail is sort of in the rearview mirror. We're really now sitting squarely in yet another S-curve, is a way to think about it, another generation of retail. And this is sort of the integrated generation. It's the blend of store-based retailers with marketplaces and what I'll describe as intermediaries. As you think about this Generation 3 retail, what's really different about it is, as you think back on the simple value chain of Generation 2 retailers, consumers would go to a store, brands would supply those stores, some stores were more effective than others, but the world that we live in today is one that looks a little bit more like this, perhaps. That is where there are still brands moving through distribution networks out to retail stores, as you see at the top of this slide. But what's new here is there are 2 new entrants that weren't in this industry 25 and 30 years ago when you saw the Targets and the Walmarts and the Carrefours and the Tescos scaling their businesses around the world. The first of these are the so-called marketplaces, and the second of these are the intermediaries. Intermediaries, for purpose of our definitions today, are just the large-scale influencers. It's the search engines, it's the social engines. These are people that typically are being paid and incented to aggregate very large audiences and to direct them in a specific way. So if I'm running a brand or a retailer, I buy keywords on Google, I drive lots of demand around those keywords, and in turn drive that to some kind of conversion in my store, whether it's a physical or digital store. So as you think about this marketplace and you think about the role of intermediaries, the big shift here perhaps is, from a consumer point of view, is think about where consumers go today to begin their shopping trip. What's the first moment of truth today for most consumers? Is it at the shelf, where we used to think it was sitting at the shelf, where we spent so much time in the world of shopper marketing and shelf conditions and in-store signage? I think everybody here has at least one experience in their life, and maybe multiple experiences, where categories or maybe even entire trips, where your first moment of truth is actually now sitting inside some kind of influencer or intermediary that's giving you the information that you need to better direct the purchase of the item. Or in fact, we're going directly into a marketplace of one kind or another, where in that marketplace, for example, we're searching for a particular type of merchandise. I think all of you know that Amazon now, in many of the markets where it operates, is the #1 place that consumers go when they're looking for product, especially infrequently purchased products that they're trying to sort of get their arms around. These marketplaces have become, as many of you are deeply aware, very sophisticated companies. In the end, they are not really dependent or even organized fully around the world of retail as much as they are simply technologists who happen to have a retail business. I think many of you have seen the presentation from Alibaba. It's very similar across the marketplaces. Amazon has a very similar slide that really display the architecture of a typical marketplace. And so we're sort of looking from the bottom up. The common attributes across all these markets is virtually all of them have some kind of cloud computing capability, not only because they want to build their own capacity ahead of need, but because, in fact, as you all well know, when you generate 10 or 11 or 12 or $14 billion worth of revenue here, this tends to carry 40 and 50% profit margins, so it's a very, very profitable business. And importantly, at companies like Amazon and companies like Alibaba, these are places where tons of coders are working in data centers around the world 24/7, generating a lot of the features and functions that you actually will use both in your B2B world and in B2C. Secondly, and importantly, these companies are using their shopping data in the world of marketing services and data management. And I think everybody here is beginning to understand Google is one place that we go, Facebook is one place that we go when we want to take our marketing spend to reach a particular audience. We're increasingly learning that companies such as Alibaba have a platform of their own which will take you exactly to the same kind of targeted audience. in their instance, able to reach 300, 400, 500 million people across their ecosystem today. Logistics networks, payment and financial systems. Payment and financial systems are so important. They're crossing borders very quickly. They give these companies tremendous insights into what people are buying, not just when they're buying on the platform, but everywhere that people shop. Digital media and entertainment assets, core commerce assets, and local assets. And one thing that's very clear as I've sort of studied these marketplaces over the last several years is this stack continues to grow. They continue to add assets and functionality inside of each one of these areas. And what happens as an outcome is it really increases the switching costs for consumers and perhaps for businesses that are working with them. Switching costs, the amount that you'd have to pay somebody to leave. Ask yourself this question: if you're a heavy Amazon user, how much would I have to pay you to leave and never come back? And I think a lot of you would have a pretty high number when you sort of thought about what it really would take to get you out of that ecosystem. It would be a big number. Interestingly, it's not just what you see that's going on in these marketplaces. Sometimes it's what's going on in the background that's most powerful. I think most of you know companies like Alibaba have unified IDs. So no matter what platform you're on, no matter what device you're using, they actually have the ability to track and trace you across all of their platforms, thereby giving them a much more robust point of view on who you are, what your preferences are. It's truly permissioned and privileged, data that they can use and that marketers can use to really target you. As you really step back from this and think about the long term, where do these marketplaces go? And if you're a brand and you're trying to reach consumers, there's one thing that's very clear to me as I've kind of looked at these marketplaces over time. One thing that's clear is there always will be equities. There'll be people who are building and developing brand equities, and I believe there'll always be consumers. But as you kind of look at the architecture of these marketplaces, what's increasingly clear to me is that they're building a platform onto which all commerce could go. They're building platforms onto which all stores could operate. And what I'm simply suggesting to you is that in the heart and soul of some of these platforms, they're really building an architecture where they have the enterprise capability to host another retailer, a store-based retailer such as a Whole Foods. Bring them on the platform. Open them to the world. Change the way they buy, change the way they operate, change the way they sell, and change the way that they administer their business. These multi-tiered platforms are bringing incredible reach. At the same time, I think all of you know that these so-called intermediaries, or influencers if you want to, digital influencers, too have tremendous reach. Search engines, messaging apps, just think about all the interactions that you see people having every day that aren't about commerce necessarily, but where they're exposed to individual products and offers and opportunities. And look at, for example, how the restaurant industry has been impacted by the delivery services and by, in fact, Instacarts of the world and the Postmates of the world that are in some level changing the way and the consumer's expectation around how they interact with your store. As we sort of move forward, it's really important for us all to know these aren't casual companies. Tencent is a company I've been following for quite a while. Tencent has an audience today of around 840 million people that are interacting with its platforms today. 840 million people on these platforms. They're on gaming system platforms, they're on social networks, they're on PC games, mobile games, they're in advertising platforms, they're on e-commerce platforms. So just think about this with these unified IDs that allow you to get traceability and transparency, permissioned traceability, transparency across these platforms. You can see the scale and scope of these platforms are changing significantly. How does this translate into a consumer benefit? What's really different here? As you really observe the world, what I'd say simply is most consumers today have at least 6 ways to source product. Any brand that you'd find in a store, they have at least 6 ways. One of those is they go back to the store and they pick it and they pack it and they take it home, the traditional trip. Another one is I select the item, discover the item, and the store brings it to me. Or thirdly, as is increasingly happening, that retailer's actually putting that product on the marketplace. So you'll find the Limited on Taobao, and you can actually go to that marketplace and buy the product from that particular retailer. Or as you'll see, brands too are finding that in some instances, that the only way to reliably reach their retailer is not to put the product on the shelf, but in fact to put it in a marketplace, which creates a fourth way. And as you can see, of course, you can buy directly from the marketplace, and in some cases, you can buy directly from the intermediaries. Companies like Google, as you all well know, are getting closer and closer to becoming a marketplace than they are a pure play search engine. So as you step back and think a little bit about this, I found Jack Ma's recent statements just really interesting and a great way to think about not just today, but where we're headed into the future. In his sort of thinking about the world, he splits the world into the old world and the new world. And interestingly, this is kind of the same story I tell my kids. You want to be on the platform. You don't want to be outside the platform. Make sure you learn how these platforms work. Make sure that you really see how they're built, how they're architected, what the underlying capability are. Because whether it's cars or hospital beds or tires, you pick the category, you pick the experience. The marketplaces are going to have a point of view on how those products are distributed, candidly, on how those products are manufactured and how they're distributed in the world. So there's a number of lessons that we have from across these marketplaces, but maybe the first and most important one that a professor at MIT Media Lab reminded us of 5 years ago, and I constantly think a lot about. Data, by definition, is historical. By definition. In fact, the real interesting thing about the marketplaces, they do run on data, but they run on real-time data. So you have a recency effect, and you have the ability to see what's happening now. And with the ability to see what's happening now and to talk to consumers now, interact with the consumer now, you reduce risk. And in that context, especially with automation and AI, as I'll describe, this real-time notion of the world that we live in, the real-time nation of retail, is now sort of an underlying platform. So for those of you that run stores today, you're now competing with companies that are running 24/7. They have teams of people, sometimes on 3 different continents, so they can hit all the time zones, and they're running 3 shifts a day in those offices. And they're driving demand, they're driving sort of the commercial interaction, they're managing supply, and they're providing the analytics. The really interesting thing for brands is that if you try to lay out a logical point of view on what channels look like, and channels are very important to the thinking for brands. It impacts how we think about trade spend, for example. It influences hugely how we think about new product innovation, how we think about new product distribution. And if you start to think about the world that we live in today, had I drawn this chart 20 years ago, I would have put supercenters, club stores, chain drug stores, specialty stores. But in fact, today, if you look in the upper left-hand corner of this, there are 70 different types of store-based retailers today, and you'll notice I've clustered them all together into one box. And what sort of crowded out the slide today is you can see now that there's a number of different digital platforms that are expanding around the world that are competing for the same trip, competing for the same shopper. If you're a brand here in the room, the challenge is, do we have any channels anymore? Do we have a way to actually give preference from a product point of view, from a brand point of view, from a package point of view? And if we do, how do we execute on that? I think all of us also know that these platforms are built on algorithms, artificial intelligence, machine learning, and there's a lot of issues with these things. But if you actually look at, for example, how the Amazon pricing engine works, it runs off of a lot of data. In some cases, it runs real time. And what's really important for all us members is that all these algorithms do is it just processes data. And the data itself defines what's next. So the algorithm is a set of rules, it processes data, And what we'll find in the US today and what we find in the world today is the profound impact that these algorithms are having on price. If you looked at the average brand today and said, what's the consumer's real willingness to pay for this product? What will they really pay for this product? And bring it down 20% and say, that's kind of what I was getting on average in the store-based world. But if you actually look at what these algorithms can do over time, is they can actually drive down the average retail selling price significantly depending on the item, especially frequently bought, high volume, particular products. And if you really look at this, then who's the winner in this? It's not the retailer, it's not the manufacturer. The winner in this is the consumer. So there's just no question that the value gap for brands has been sort of compressed and that the consumer is really walking away with substantial benefit in the world that we're in today. Not the world we're headed to, but the world we're sitting into today. Another important lesson is that these shoppers engage across lots of platforms. There's no, I just go to the store, I just go online, or I just go online and pick it up. I do all three of those things, and you'll find that there's 4 or 5 different shopper segments that do that pretty routinely. And lastly, when I look at the G3, there's so many important lessons. But for brands, I think the number one sort of wake-up call is this. If I walked into a typical store here in Europe, I'd expect to see 20 feet of Coca-Cola products, 30 feet of Coca-Cola products, and I'd expect to see them outposted, and I'd expect to see them well merchandised across the store. Lots of facings, lots of inventory, well presented, well signed. When I go online, every product gets one facing. Everything gets one facing, irrespective of your market share. And when you think about the time it takes to get from the home page, whatever that home page is, whichever marketplace you're in, getting down to that item detail page where your product is actually featured, you have a lot of influence over the content that's on your item detail page. But if you look at all the pages that consumers can go to, these sort of transitional pages, including search, take a look at the numbers that you get if you search for detergent at Amazon today. There are 70,228 options if you just type in the word detergent. It's a fair amount of choice, would we agree? Now let's just assume that there's a little bit of overlap in all of this. But the point is, from a merchandising point of view and a brand marketing point of view, this is a completely different environment. How do I audit this? How do I manage this so that I'm really maximizing the potential of that consumer discovering my product and converting on my product? This is the complexity of managing big brands, legacy brands in a sense, inside of these very, very large marketplaces. There are lots of learnings here, but the most important one for me on this entire page is change is now coming from outside our industry. This is not one type of store fighting another store. This is technologists who are competing with store-based retailers. And as you think about your world ahead, I would say there are lots of good retailers working on lots of important initiatives. Maybe the most important one is to get your positioning right. There's only 5 positionings in the world today that allow you to earn a rate of return that's above your cost of capital. So in the US today, for example, retailers that represent about 40% of all the sales, all the retail sales in the US, do not earn their cost of capital. 40%. Maybe those retailers will be significantly challenged and have to really rethink how they allocate their capital as we go forward. Store and network renewal, changing the demand generation models, how we use analytics, how we organize and align our fulfillment. But maybe as importantly, as you'll see in the center of the slide, is how we get our cost structures lined up and how we get our workforce lined up. Doug McMillon from Walmart made a speech, I think it was at the Bank of America presentation back in March. And I encourage everybody in the room to go listen to that presentation. It's 40 minutes long or something like that. It is really good. And the reason it's really good is he really laid out, for the benefit of anybody who wanted to listen, how a large company like Walmart is transitioning itself to be competitive in a G3 world. Now, as I sit here and chat this with you and we think about G3, I personally have been working on what comes after today. And I'll simply call that G4. It's now coming. And G4 is different than G3 in the following way. It's the convergence of the physical and the digital. And so as you think about the world and what this really means, I'm really suggesting that these tens of thousands of intermediaries that are out there today and these 250 large marketplaces are going to end up in 25 very large scale platforms. We're not going to have tens of thousands of these. We're going to have 25 or 50 that are really the dominant digital platforms that people are using in the world. You can begin to pick who those winners are. And if I was a retailer in the room, it's really important to pick who the winners are, because eventually you're going to have to go on one of these platforms. As you think about this, I know all of you watch the headlines. All of these marketplaces are globalizing. Technology crosses borders much more easily than physical stores. And creating a presence to run data centers, to run retail centers, all of this is much easier to do than it is to license a store. What amazes me in the recent press is you see these marketplaces negotiating trade agreements like they were countries, like they were a country, like they flew a flag and they had diplomats. But in fact, these trade agreements are very significant because the countries are actually engaging commercially and endorsing platforms for commerce. This, of course, will help many developing countries who may not have the capital to launch a platform for themselves in their own geography. So what I continue to expect, is this whole notion of continued concentration. We're moving to 50, 25, somewhere in that zone, big platforms. And if you start thinking about that, all of these platforms are going to continue to engage with even more tech. And if you really look at it, there's this great company called CB Insights. They track the patents of all these marketplaces and more. And if you look at the number of patents that these companies are engaging with, and then the number of sort of open source strategies they have in order to solve real technologic problems, you can see that they're really, as you heard this morning, they're taking on the very difficult issues. They're really engaging the consumer in their issue. They're really engaging the consumer in the discovery. And as they do that, they add to the feature sets. So what can you expect? What you can expect is across all these big platforms in the world is that the feature sets will continue to grow. They'll get bigger and they'll add more and more services. So health services are on their way. Pharmaceutical sales are on their way. So as we begin to think about engagement from a consumer point of view, once you go into one of these marketplaces, it's where you get your entertainment, it's where you store your photos, it's where you buy your groceries, it's where you get your medical advice, and it's where you fulfill your prescriptions. If you think about the acquisition of Whole Foods, Morgan Stanley does just terrific work always to think about the economics. Like, what are the positive, what are we going to see from an economic, pure accretion point of view? And you can see here that it's hugely accretive to Amazon to buy Whole Foods. But I think as a first pass, if you'll look down the left-hand side with me, I think this hugely, as time goes on, said differently, as time goes on, I think this will prove to be really on the low side. Here's why. One, the Prime shopper in particular will increasingly have a very seamless experience. Order anywhere, buy anywhere, pick up anywhere, where they have these kind of stores. Secondly, with proximity, that is the proximity of the Whole Foods stores, married with the Amazon fulfillment centers. Most of you know Amazon has a fulfillment center that's within 20 miles of about half the demand in the US. That's kind of the pattern. Half the demand, they're within 20 miles. So you marry that with a store model, and you get a very interesting speed advantage over people who don't have the same platform. This food retail experience. I think all of us understand Whole Foods has a tremendous ability in urban fresh. They've got the supply chains, their private labels are interesting. And one of the most interesting parts of these models is that Amazon has great insight on the long tail. Everybody knows what's going on with the first 20 million SKUs on Amazon. It's easy to see. What's really hard to see is what's going on with the next 200 million SKUs. And when you get visibility into the next 200 million SKUs, you can actually see by latitude and longitude where the high demand is for the low frequency products, and you can do automatic allocation to those stores without a buyer meeting anybody. I can localize your store off the long tail, fundamentally forcing and changing distribution without human intervention. Now you need supervision, but without serious sell-side models. Everyone's aware of the Dollar Shave Club. If you think about the demand gen model that they have, how they attract consumers, how they convert consumers, and of course, this will also impact the way that they buy. I anticipate that the store networks of Amazon and the store networks of Whole Foods will come together. It's not just going to be, let's go build more Whole Foods. As you saw this morning, we're going to see many more executions that bring together the competencies of all these companies. So let me close this part with this. As we move out towards 2020, and if you're in some parts of the world, this won't apply, but this definitely applies in the Koreas, this definitely applies in the Japans, the US, Canada, most parts of Europe. What I anticipate is 25 to 50 very large platforms that are controlling 25% of all retail sales. And I think that number may go up because retailers may discover that the value equation that is of these platforms and their ability to provide, candidly, fundamental enterprise to an individual retailer, you may find yourself saying, you know what, I really want to be on the Amazon platform. I don't want you to buy me, I want to be on the platform. I want to utilize the tools. The Amazon Go, in my thesis, isn't about them building a lot of stores. It's about building a toolkit that'll be interesting to retailers who are on my platform. So as you think about what you can expect going forward, 25 or 30% of all retail will involve digital. The value stack, how they engage with consumers and so on, will continue to go. Global, feature-rich, very short cycle, very vertically integrated. This O2O, I think we're right at the beginning of this. I know 4 or 5 other retailers that are testing, and we're at the very beginning of O2O. And as you start thinking about this, understand that retailers will engage with the platforms as an enterprise infrastructure company. So what does this really mean to you? What I really think is that in order to earn your cost of capital, that is, as a retailer, to earn your cost of capital, you have to make a fundamental transition. And the transition is to move from a store-based retailer who has some technology, maybe even a .com or two, to really become a tech platform with stores, to really put your stores into a network that either you built organically or one that you joined into as a platform. While this may sound abstract as we kind of look at the intergenerations, this is very much of an and world. Great companies like Coca-Cola, Procter & Gamble, what they have to think about as they go through the world is they have lots of countries and lots of volume that is still at the G1 level. They have to be really good at that. They have lots of customers that are still living in a G2 world. They have to be really good at that. Service them, make sure they're successful. And yet, as we move to G3, and in some markets, as we begin to migrate towards G4, the requirements for brands is even more sophisticated, as you can see. And we're doing this in a world where consumption may or may not be growing at the speed we want, and our resources are obviously being challenged significantly. And I'd like to close with this simple slide and say, I'm spending about half of my time today thinking about how all of this impacts people. So what's going to happen? How do we ready our people And I would challenge each of you to the following thing. In your organization, ask yourself this question: how many people that sit around your table actually know what these words mean? How many of them actually know what a G3 retail marketplace looks like? How many of them know what a marketplace really looks like? How many of them know what unified IDs really are? And as we sort of move out into the world ahead, what I want each of you to be thinking about is our responsibility, and it's a significant responsibility, to really think about what the skills are that our people are going to need, whether they work for you or don't work for you in the future. What are the future skills that they're going to need to be successful in the marketplace that we're headed into? As I sort of look at my research and all the things that I'm poking around with at this great program in Cambridge, dislocation of individuals in the marketplace is very top of mind and should be for every person, I think, here in this room. How will we keep people happy and productive as we move out into the next decade ahead? Thank you all very much for your time.
Thank you, Dan. Fantastic.